everybody get set up. Talk amongst yourselves. At appropriate levels of volume. Inside. So, for those of you who have, perhaps you're a little newer to the congregation, or maybe you're visiting with us, or just been here a month or two, you may not have seen one of these before. So, on a normal Sunday, we have a sermon, various people preach, and I think that's very important, and is really the lion's share of our services. But occasionally,
Come on, Cody.
but occasionally, we'll conduct these interviews, and I think the last one we did with Chelsea, and before that I think Jeff, and then before that Juan, and then we can keep going back. But and Amber, and I like to do these about once a quarter, because I think that they're a refreshing way to gain insights into spirituality. And a different way. And for some people, it's a little easier to listen to because it's a conversation. And so I wanted to interview Ramayan. Ramayan and I are really great friends. And Ramayan has recently been through some pretty wild stuff.
Sure.
And so we're going to take a moment, maybe the first 10 minutes or so, and I'm just going to ask him a little bit about his conversion story and how he found God and why he stuck with him. But really what we really want to delve into is that Ramayan recently had quadruple bypass surgery on his heart, which I think is the only place you can have.
That's probably true. But I'm not a doctor.
No, but you feel like you're closer to being a doctor now.
Yeah, that's true.
And that was just, that was now just 2.5 months ago?
Yeah, something like that.
Which is
Mid-December.
crazy. So I just want to ask him about that experience, because, I want to start with a verse in James chapter 1. If you've been around the church for a while, or you've been a follower of Jesus for some time, this verse is really important for us, because it turns upside down the way we're taught to think about pain.
Yes.
And pain is such a formative thing in our lives. The thing about pain is that maybe the only thing you can't do with pain is nothing. Like, it either drives you further away from God and people, or closer.
Yeah.
But no one reacts to pain zero. You know what I mean? Like, we have a response to it. James 1:19. James 1 verse 2 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith produces perseverance. We must let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." So, Ramayan, welcome to the stage.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by just asking you a little bit about. There's so much I would like to talk to Ramayan about, like childhood and growing up, but we're going to really stick to the script as much as we can. I was hoping that you could share with the group in a couple minutes just how did you become a Christian? Like a little bit of what your life was like before. How did you get met and you came out, and why did you choose to follow Jesus?
I did think about that. You did warn me you were going to ask me that. It's kind of funny. I was going to share about sort of my, how I was met and all that, but I think God really plays the long game with us, and it really kind of goes all the way back to when I was a kid. And my mom would frustrate the tar out of me because it's the first scripture I learned was "Seek and you will find," which she would tell me anytime I was looking for a toy or something like that.
It's annoying.
Yeah, I was like, so the Bible was in there a really long time. But one of the cool things is she taught me to pray. And to pray, just talk to God like he's a friend, like he's chilling right next to you. So that was kind of the first seed. And then when I was in high school, there was this kid, and he was, really faithful, and he was always talking about God and that sort of thing. And I didn't really do that, but I believed in God. And it kind of made me think, like, well, if I believe in God, I should probably know what that means. And so that was like the second seed.
You're like 15?
Yeah, 15-ish, yep.
It's a pretty mature thought.
Yeah, I know. I was looking back, and one of my top thoughts.
Yeah.
And so then, obviously, I kind of did the high school thing. I was in college. And the funny part of this whole conversion story is actually the guy, many of you may know him, his name's Malcolm Davis, who met me. Actually, we knew each other before we were both Christians, and we hated each other.
Nice.
It's a great story. So we were both in a psychology class. He was taking it because he had to. I was taking it because I was trying to be all deep and, that kind of thing. Actually, no, it was philosophy even worse. And so, he would come in and he was just blowing the class off, trying to get like that, easy D-. he's talking about
Typical Malcolm.
Yeah, which is funny because if you know Malcolm, it's totally not who he is now. But he was like talking about all the stuff and parties, and I'm like, gosh, will this guy shut up? Like, how is he even here? And so that was like kind of my memory. And he shared later, he's like, man, I can't stand that guy. He's so stuck up. So it was kind of this mutual like, ugh, that guy. And then like later on,
Sounds like the beginning of a great friend.
exactly. A couple of years later, he's become a Christian. He's been a Christian now for a year. Runs into me while I'm at, doing this job at this building, and he approaches me. And at first I don't recognize him, and he's like, you know how you start conversations when you're trying to share your faith. You pick anything. Oh, nice radio. I'm like, this guy.
Do you want to follow Jesus?
Right. Yeah. He's like, if you know Malcolm, he's like 6 foot something, and he's kind of just, a little intimidating. He just walks up to you and starts talking about your radio, and I'm like, what's this guy trying to do? Like, am I safe? I'm like, yeah, it's cool. And then I eventually realized who he is, and I'm like, oh, you. And then but it's cool because he's a Christian now, and he started, reaching out to me, and he was inviting me to church, and I couldn't make it because of my work schedule. So he would like ride around with me. I had a delivery job, and he would ride around with me in the car while I was delivering, and we would just talk about the Bible for hours. Wow. And I was just, at this point, what I hadn't shared is that I also had started to seek God pretty heavy. And so I had been listening to the whole Bible over and over again, different audio Bibles. And so I was like, grilling, what does your church think about this? What do you think about this? And we're going back and forth. And so it bonded us deeply. To this day, if we have a friend who's really, into deep spirituality, we instantly call on each other. Yeah. So he invited me out. Eventually I came, but I didn't come right away. What happened was his interest, which is funny, was in a play that I happened to be assistant directing. And so we didn't expect to see
Do you remember the play?
Oh, that's a good question. It was at Washington Community College, and I think it was Mama, I Want to Sing. It was actually a musical.
I don't know if it sounds like one I want.
No, you probably would never start. And so, long story short, I run into a bunch of disciples outside during intermission, and Malcolm's there. I'm like, what are you doing here? He's like, oh, I'm here to see so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And they're in the play, and I had no idea that they were friends of his. And so earlier that week, I had been praying, God, I had a friend I was trying to influence for God, but I didn't really know how to do it. Yeah. And I was talking to him, and I'm like, God, just put me around the people that you need me to be around so that I can be effective for you. Mm-hmm. And so I'm standing now in a circle of 12 disciples, right? Literally. It's like, Jesus, do you think this is works? This gonna work. And I'm like, aha. And so I was driving back after I was like, you guys all do this church? That's crazy. I was driving home, and I'm like, wow, that's really cool, God. You brought church to me even though I didn't go. Yeah. And so the next week I obviously went, studied the Bible. 2 weeks later, got baptized, became a disciple, and was the rest is history. Yeah, that's awesome. And how many years ago was that now? It was about 5 years ago. Yeah. That was 25? So I think it's actually, it's 96, so whatever that is. I don't do math on Sundays. That's closer to 30. I don't do math on Sundays. I don't know math. Really good. 8.5 years, something like that. Well, yeah, obviously we're skipping almost 3 decades of life and growth. But I think it's important to know that, of course, things happen in those 3 decades. Yes. And in some ways, we're just fast forwarding to what will be for the rest of your life a major highlight of your life. Yeah. / low light. But I think in the aftermath, for sure. It's a definitive moment. That's a better way to say it. So I want to fast forward a little bit to, can you give us a little bit of context for how you figured out that you needed heart surgery? What happened that made you go to the doctor? What did they say? Give us a little bit about that. Well, so it was something that I could have easily blown off. It was just a Friday evening, and I kind of noticed a little bit of, discomfort. It wasn't super mild. I was just like, oh, my chest is feeling kind of heavy. And then a few minutes later, I was like, oh, I'm kind of a little winded, and I didn't think much of it for about an hour or so. And then I eventually mentioned it to Jen, and I'm like, well, I don't know, this is feeling a little weird, but it could just be indigestion or whatever. So we kind of did the normal things that you would do to get rid of indigestion. Mm-hmm. And but it kind of persisted for 3 hours. And at that point I was like, what's weird about this is it hasn't gone down or gone up, it's just consistent. Yeah. And so I was like, that's kind of weird. And I felt the Spirit just nudging me, like, you should probably go get this looked at. I was like wanting to go to sleep. I almost did, but I ended up going to urgent care.
Yeah.
And they were like, we can't see anything on the EKG, but why don't you go to ER? They'll probably just, draw your blood and you can go home.
It's like everyone's worst nightmare. Why don't you go to the
I know. I definitely thought that. I was like, is there
But
another
do I have to?
Right. I was like, is there another way?
Yeah.
Take this cup.
Yeah, what about like WebMD or something?
Right, yeah.
Check that out.
Exactly. And so I went and they did their blood draw, and there's something called troponin levels, which is like kind of illustrates whether or not your heart is in distress or it's fine. And I guess it's supposed to be in the single digits, and mine was 100, which sounds like a lot, but way later I was told there are people who have it in the tens of thousands. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like how do you think? But it was still really hot for a person who was just normal walking around. So they were like, you have a little bit of cold, maybe it's myocarditis, we'll keep it overnight, blah, blah, blah. It still kind of seems like, oh, this is probably going to be no big deal. But then the next day, cardiologist comes, visits, and I'm like, oh, I want to talk to you. But and so he's like, well, we want to do a heart cath. And I'm like, what's that? And he's like, I know what a cath is. How does that work with the heart? So, and he's like, well, we go in through your vein and all the way up into your heart, this little thing, and I'm like, well, that sounds terrifying. Like, I do not want to do that.
He's totally downplaying it.
Yeah.
What, guys, no big deal.
Right, yeah, he's like,
Put a
it's
needle
totally
in
wrong.
your arm.
For him, it's like a Monday. Not for me, it's like, what?
Yeah.
First invasive surgery.
Yes.
So, I was freaking out for like 2 days, because I'm like, it's basically, anything could happen to make you sign this thing. Well, if we pump your heart thing, it's not our fault, and I'm like, I don't want to do it. I was freaking out, as you know, and I called a disciple who I've known for like 30 years, who's a doctor. I'm like, is this really the only way? He's like, yeah, it's kind of the only way. I'm like, why don't you say something different? And I prayed about it a lot. I talked to you, I talked to Jen, I talked to friends of mine, and I think the biggest thing that moved me in that moment was just, okay, God led me here. Mm-hmm. Clearly, I'm in this room because God put it on my heart to go to urgent care, which unfolded a chain of events. And I was like, all right, I trust you. Yeah, I was freaking out about it a little bit, but I did it. And so I do the heart cath, which was way less dramatic than I had built it up to be in my mind. But as I'm not even unhooked yet, and the cardiologist, my favorite person, comes into the room, and he's like, dude, you need bypass surgery. Like, just drops it on me like that. I mean, his bedside manner, not so great. But he's like, points at the big screen, like, it's still going, like, you can still
like,
see.
Did you see the game last night?
You can still see, like, the ink stuff. And he's like, you see this little space right here? Well, you see this big space? That's the way it's supposed to be. And this is you. This is like what it's all. And you've got 3 of those. And he's like, you've got 70% blockage in one, 80% blockage in another, and 90 in another.
Wow.
And I'm like, what do you say to that? It's like, I'm just still like processing everything that's just happened.
Yeah.
Suddenly the heart cath seems like no big deal and doing it. And so that was pretty intense. That was the point at which I was so then it became another thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, bypass surgery. And like, is there I had researched this all before, but kind of what are the options? I was like, what about a stent? He's like, you're not even a candidate for stent. We can't fit it in there.
Yeah.
And so
that's how you found out.
That's how I found out.
And you shared about how I want to particularly spend most of the rest of our time on kind of like the response and the aftermath.
Yeah.
So you said that you freaked out. Like there was like a human moment, because obviously I got to witness firsthand, like alongside Jen, and Jen was amazing during this time.
Big time.
And I got to witness like firsthand the faith. It was one thing to hear about it, because like you can romanticize. We all romanticize stories, right? Like when somebody shares with somebody at some event, you're like, they're so great, and people in the back are like, it's not always that great. But you're kind of like, eh.
Sure.
But I really felt like being in the front row, like I was really amazed by your faithfulness. And I do want to talk about that, but I think it's important also to talk about like even the most faithful people have weak moments, right? Like we're very human, You see,
Sure.
Ramayan, you've been a disciple for almost 30 years. I consider you a very strong disciple, and yet you felt like there were times when your instinct was to, in other words, freak out.
Yeah.
Like what fears came? Like what fears were you battling in those moments of uncertainty? Maybe before you had processed and like prayed and like worked it out.
Right.
Like because there's always a space when you get information and then when you process that information in a faithful way.
Oh, yeah.
There's a really dangerous space in between
Yeah.
that you existed for a while.
Yeah.
And that's when we like our crazy person comes out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
When we lose it or we break down or whatever. And I don't think that lasted very long for you because of your faithfulness, but when it did last, what were you wrestling with?
That's a good question. I would say initially, even with the heart cath, my initial response was like very Jonah-ish. Like, oh, I'm getting on the first boat and going another way. Like, no way. And then I think I got through that, just through the confirmation of God speaking to me through multiple people.
Interesting.
Like I prayed about, like, okay, God, I have this funny thing that I do. I'll pray before I talk to someone that God will not allow them to say anything that's not from Him.
That's a scary prayer.
And that thereby
You better think about who you're talking to. After
Yes,
prayer.
yes. It's I reserve it for special occasions,
Yeah.
but it's it gives me the reassurance that whatever they say is from God. And that can be, hard to hear or easy to hear depending on how severe it is, but it puts me at peace. And there's been a situation where, I prayed that one time. I was asking this brother advice, and he was like, well, first of all, I think blah, blah, blah. And second of all, I think blah, blah, blah. And third of all, pauses. And I was like, man, I can't remember my thought. I'm like, it's okay. I designed it that way. So I think that got me through the first, Jonah response to the heart cath. But at that point, I think, with the bypass surgery, that's huge. That's
Yeah.
It could be it,
It's life-threatening.
Yeah.
For sure.
They make you sign these big forms, like, hey, it's not our fault, and it's deep. I think Jennifer was a big part of me getting through that, But some of the things I was feeling was, like when I got to that level, and I shared this with you, I think, I was like, well, at first I was like, no, and then I was like, well, so many people I know have died. And so many friends, and so many relatives, and I feel like, well, I'm not really better than them, So I kind of felt, it's funny, Abram sharing, I kind of went down that road. I'm like, well, I'm not really that great, and I'm not really contributing much to these areas and that areas, and I haven't done as much as I could have with my gifts and all these things. So I kind of went down a similar road as what he shared, is like sort of going through all of the things, all the reasons why God really isn't obligated to save my life. And I prayed for it, but I was like, it could be it, So I think that was probably the low point, was just that, what is my life anyway, really? What impact have I had? Why would God let me live?
Yeah.
And so that was probably one of the lower sort of scary parts.
I appreciate your vulnerability, and there are two main themes I think from that. First was I was actually unexpected. Like when I crafted these questions, I was thinking, I wasn't necessarily going for a certain response, I just want to talk, but what I didn't expect you to say was how you dealt with your uncertainty about what was best. I feel like that is such a huge part of our lives. Like there's so many times where we're uncertain and we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I think what you displayed was a true example of humility. And I think you showed that humility to God is synonymous with humility to people.
Yeah.
As long as you're choosing spiritual people,
Yeah.
they're the same thing. And that's a really scary thing to pray. If you're like, God, I'll be humble to you, but I'm not going to listen to anybody.
Right.
God's like, how do you want me to dictate this
I don't
message?
know how to answer that.
You know what I mean? And I do think that the Bible has all the answers we need, but it's not always enough. What I mean by that is that we need people to
Yes.
help us understand God's
100%.
word in our context.
Yeah.
And I feel like when you pray something like, God, when I have these three conversations, I want you to speak or not speak, you kind of got to buckle up for what they're going to say.
For sure.
Yes.
Or kind of be someone who breaks an oath. Because you pray this thing to God. But it requires so much faith to do that. In my mind, it's connected to this lesson on prayer we've been doing about the specificity of that. because now you take that as God's answer.
Yes.
And some might say, like, well, that's a childish way to think about it. And in my mind, actually, I think it shows a level of faithfulness that's very mature because it simplifies things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that things being sophisticated or complicated means that you're thinking about it the right way.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the simplest way. And I think what you did there was you just asked God, like, this is difficult. I don't know what to do. I don't really trust myself to make the decision, which shows humility. So use other people in my life to do that. And because you've invested so much in the church, it's yet another amazing byproduct of devoting yourself to church. You have all these avenues to do that. And so I appreciate humility there. And I think the second one was just kind of the surreality of the moment for you and how you, because of your life of faith, you process it through a lens of faith. I think is just really important. And that's why I think when you're younger in your faith, you're more susceptible to leaving God because you don't trust Him yet.
Yeah.
But after those 3 decades, I think that if a younger Christian went through this, I would have been more concerned at some point in the process, like, how's their faith doing? Like, are they feeling like they might want to drift because they're like, why would God do this to me?
Right.
That never crossed my mind with you, and it never crossed your mind. And so I think that to me is a testament to your faithfulness and to the way you've built your life. And perhaps to those of us out here that are just starting our journey with God, the kind of result of what you could become. Like, that's what you want. Like, when something really hard happens, you're never going to be able to completely bypass fear or uncertainty.
No.
It's just a part of your life.
Yes.
But you can bypass the, I don't trust God. Like, that never happened in your life. You just weren't sure what to do. There was uncertainty, and that's always going to be there. I wanted to ask, perhaps one of the last questions. In hindsight, I mean, you're not that far removed.
No.
Could you talk maybe just spend a couple minutes briefly on your recovery and what that's been like? Because it's not like you get this surgery and you wake up the next day and you're like, all right, let's go play pickleball. You know what I mean? You had a pretty pretty intense recovery. Could you speak a little bit to those moments when you woke up and what it was like in the aftermath? And then I'll just one final question about kind of the spirituality of this time. But just talk about the aftermath a little bit.
Well, it's funny. Jen could probably talk more about when I woke up. Because she was right there and probably saved my life because they weren't really, we weren't synced up. The doctors and I had like stuff in my throat. So it's pretty crazy. It was pretty traumatic, I think. Not that I remember a ton of it, but it was apparently a very funny time and a very traumatic time. I was loopy and saying all kinds of things because of the drugs, but it was hard. I think, when you wake up from it, whenever I kind of realized that I had woken up, right, I was relieved and encouraged that God was like, yeah, you get another chance, but also there was a lot of pain and a lot of discomfort. And I think that's the other thing that you go through, right? Like you go through this is going to happen, and that's more the anticipation, but then now you're like, I got to go uphill, with this. And that can be challenging too, I think. One of the things that is a part of my recovery now and was in the hospital was just faithful determination to sort of get out of the hospital, to get back to my family, and to, kind of just come out of this in a better way than I went into it. And I think that kind of roots back. I thought about your question that you kind of told me you were going to ask about just, how'd you get to this faithfully and all that. And I think it's not something that, like you said, it's not something that happens in the moment. The things that I leaned on were, like Philippians 4, and John 14, where it's like, over time I've built this trust in God so that I knew that I could rely on Him this time. And so I think that's something I continue to recover, be a part of my recovery. Like, this is hard, I don't want to go to cardiac rehab, blah, 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 but I trust that God put me in this scenario to be here and to be better and to follow Him and continue to trust Him. So it's a cycle.
And the last question is not one I gave you, so we'll see how it goes. But originally I was going to ask kind of what you learned about yourself, but I feel like you've talked about that a lot in a good way. I wanted to ask you, this morning Ramayan sent me like a quiet time reflection from I don't know when it was
Early
from,
January,
sometime in
yeah.
January, not long after. And I want to ask about, specifically, last question, how has this changed your perspective on life?
Mhm.
Or how has this changed the way you want to live the rest of your life?
Yeah.
Because I think about, like, have you guys ever, I'm asking like 80 people, like, I don't know, maybe don't answer out loud, but perhaps you've had a time where you've had a near-death experience, or you thought maybe something could have happened, or something, I don't know, there are times when, like, Kristen, I couldn't get a hold of Kristen, and I didn't know where she was, and you have this moment where you're like, what if? And then you're like, how am I going to keep my kids alive? You know what I mean? That's my first thought, like I'm not ever going to sleep again. But you start thinking about, like, how would my life be different, and then, she calls back, and like, thank God, and then you're thinking, like, oh, did I have any regrets in that moment? Like, that I thought, is this like a moment for God to be like, hey, just so you know, like, you might want to think about that thing, because you're going to regret it if you don't change it in 20 years. You have actually had the experience of, you had to sign papers that basically were like, hey, we think it's going to be fine. Because I remember, like, the odds were good. Like, it wasn't like 50-50.
Right, yeah.
It was like, we felt pretty good, but it's like, well, literally, there's going to be a moment where you're on the table, and like, we're going to be working on your heart. So, like, stuff can happen.
You're like a cyborg for 40 minutes.
So you have to sign this thing, right? And so, in light of that, essentially, like a near-death experience moment where you had to really reflect on that, in the aftermath and during it, has anything changed about the way you want to live the rest of your life?
It's a great question.
And I know I didn't prep you for that.
Obviously, yes, is the short answer, but I think I was thinking about this throughout it in the moment. I think something that, reflecting back on the time, really comes through for me is how much I need the people in my life to be really there and plugged into what I'm feeling and thinking. And an example of that is, obviously how much Jennifer was there, and how, she was there when I woke up, there when I went to sleep. It's just that reliance and that. I mean, I walked around afterwards. They get you up right away and you have to walk around. Sometimes you're walking out at night, and there's so many people who are just alone.
Yeah.
They're just laying there. They've only got the TV. Nobody's coming to see them. And I think so that need for people. I mean, even our conversations in the hospital. There's like two things that put me at ease about the heart surgery, and one of them was the surgeon coming in, and he talked to us, and he was just really kind of, he's an indie guy, cut and dry, really awesome demeanor.
Not the first guy that, hey, dude, you need quad bypass.
No. Funny story I can tell any of you about that. Kathy already knows. But yeah, so he just came in, he's very friendly, and he was like, look, you can research, you can do whatever, but this is the best way to do this, and you can go talk to anybody, but if any of those people come back and tell you that there's another way to do it, I'll tell you what I think about them, because it's not true, but this is the only way. That was, and just his confidence, I think, and peace was really reassuring, and I was like, hey, you had me at hello, I'm doing it. And then something you prayed was actually hugely definitive for me. One of the things you prayed when we prayed is that God, you prayed to God for God to make, even if there was someone who was incompetent, or even if there was a level of, potential for mistake, like even the incompetency be amazing competency. Like that God would flip anything that was a risk.
Like that scalpel slipped and hit the right spot.
Exactly. And I love that.
Work it, God, work it.
Right, it's like, even in their deficiency, make them awesome. And I think that was a huge prayer. Like that one was probably like, okay, because that's like all the bases are covered. It was like my question. And I think how it changes my perspective, and some of this was in what I shared with you, is that it really made me think about what I give my energy to, and what upsets me, and what gets me anxious, and the things that rile us up often don't matter in a week or two, and we got so excited, we could have had a heart attack. It was so intense, and then like we don't even remember what that thing was most of the time. A year later, so just really thinking about, like, what am I going to give my life to? What is this going to be about? How am I going to love my family? How am I going to church, how am I going to pass things down to my kids that are real values, or, how am I going to help them know me in a way? Because it was almost a possibility they wouldn't get to know huge portions of who I am and my likes and dislikes. Like I had to do this quick little voice recording of, all right, what would I say if I knew I was going to die in 3 minutes? Because they were coming to get me to wheel me out,
Wow.
And it was like,
High pressure.
and
Did you keep that?
yeah, I have it. I sent it to Jen immediately. Yeah, so that was, that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much I haven't said, done, lived. So I think that's the difference, right? Like, I am so committed to action as opposed to, I'll do it at this time in the future. Yeah, much more urgent.
Well said. Yeah, when I lived in Florida, one of the elders of the church used to say, he used to pray, every time he prayed, he would pray this thing. He would say, God, help us to care about the things that are going to matter in 1,000 years. I was almost like, that's
Wow.
You know what I mean? That's basically what you're describing. Like, are the things I'm really spending the lion's share of my time on things that are actually going to matter when we're not here anymore?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
will the impact resonate? Which really makes you not want to be selfish at all.
Yeah.
Because you're like, well, I don't want to do stuff for than just me then. You know what I mean? Like, I want it to resonate outward. So,
Exactly.
Ro, thanks for sharing your heart, and just thanks for your faith, right? I mean, I think that the example preaches so loudly to us, and I appreciate not just your faithfulness, but also kind of your honest retelling of the moments when you weren't exactly like Jesus. Like, I think the church needs to hear that too. Like, I think we need to hear that really strong people are also really weak sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's just really important. So, love you, man, and I'm super glad you're here.
Thanks.